It's hard to imagine a more odious country than Qatar. It's a dictatorship, naturally. It's part of the OPEC cartel, whose central organizing principle is to gouge the world's democracies by using oil as a weapon. It's now doing the same with natural gas, too. It may well be the laziest country in the world, too. Other than oil and gas, Qatar really produces nothing of value. But the work that they do in one of the hottest climates imaginable isn't done by native Qataris. It's done by a servant class of foreign indentured workers who have few civil rights. In fact, to call Qatar a country stretches the meaning of that word to the breaking point. There are only about 250,000 Qataris who live pretty much in one city called Doha. They're the lazy ones I mentioned, because to do all the work of the country, to build their buildings, to drill for oil and gas, to clean their kitchens and bathrooms, they import more than 1.5 million servants. So basically, each Qatari has 6 foreigners waiting on them hand and foot. There are actually more people from India in Qatar than there are actual Qataris. Now, when we Canadians invite people from other countries in here, we treat them generously, even before they become citizens. They have civil rights, they're treated as prospective Canadians, and then fully equal Canadians when they're citizens. Not so in Qatar. For example, labor unions for these foreign workers are illegal. Striking is illegal. And you can't blame the Qataris. I mean, the average Qatari wouldn't know how to blow their nose without a foreign worker to do it for them. Imagine if all of them went on strike. No. That's illegal. Often, foreign workers are promised dazzling paychecks that they plan to send back to their home countries like India to help their poor families there. But when they land in Qatar, their employers seize their passports. So they can't leave. They can't even switch jobs. And quite often, the inflated cost of their squalid living conditions and food is deducted from their paychecks. It's really not much different than a cotton plantation in the Deep South before the U.S. Civil War, except that it's not a white ruling class, it's an Arab ruling class. It's a deeply sexist country, too, with Sharia law governing matters like divorce. So women really have about as many rights as the family pet does. Qatar imports plenty of women laborers to sweep the houses and clean the toilets, but oil and gas and construction are the main thing, so the country's population is still a 3-to-1 ratio of men to women. It's pretty creepy there. Now, I mentioned Sharia law, which is the law of the land. This awful place borders Saudi Arabia, so that's not going to surprise you, which means they brutally suppress other religions. Now, when you import over 1 million servants, they're going to bring some of their own religions with them. There are a handful of churches allowed in Qatar, but by law they are forbidden from having, things like crosses. Any religious celebration must be done in private, not in public, not outdoors, not in the street. There is no freedom of religion, which isn't surprising as there are no other freedoms either. It is a medieval-style absolute monarchy. The only reason we even hear about it, the only reason it's not just an empty swath of desert with a few camels, is because of the geographical lottery that the place just happens to be on top of oil and gas. But the Qataris themselves, of course, have no clue how to develop it. That's why they need to import servants and experts. There is one other notable fact about Qatar. No, not that their current dictator deposed his own father to steal the throne. I mean, that's just a given in these places, right? I'm talking about the massive pro-terrorist propaganda network based in Qatar called Al Jazeera. Of course, like all media in an absolute dictatorship, it is controlled by the state. And in the case of Al Jazeera, it's owned by the Qatari royal family. Now, as I mentioned, there's only about 250,000 Qataris. I suppose they could sustain a TV station on their own. But the purpose of Al Jazeera is propaganda. It's about achieving political objectives around the world, which is why Al Jazeera so blatantly roots for terrorists. I'm not just talking about them being the go-to media for Al-Qaeda for every new snuff film, or back when Osama bin Laden was around for his special messages recorded in some cave that Al Jazeera would play. Now, I'm talking about, for example, its role in whipping up the masses in the Arab Spring to install the Muslim Brotherhood terrorist group in Egypt, toppling secular dictatorships to replace them with Islamic dictatorships. That's what Al Jazeera is good for. That and hiring top talent from Canada's own CBC, like former news boss Tony Berman and anti-U.S. commentator Avi Lewis. So that's Qatar. Avoid it if you can. Avoid it if you're a woman who likes freedom and doesn't like a place run by Sharia law that says a rape victim is guilty of adultery. Avoid it if you're a Christian or a Hindu or even the wrong kind of Muslim. Avoid it if you're some poor schlub from India trying to get a steady job to send money home to your family. If you're lucky, it might work, but if you're unlucky, you'll be just a step up from being some prince's slave. Now, why do I tell you this about this squalid little place where the average temperature reaches 41 degrees in the summer? The average. And if that won't suffocate you, the dictatorship will. Well, I tell you this because Qatar has big plans that involve us here in Canada. Like many dictatorships, they have a state-owned airline called Qatar Airways. Now, again, you don't really need an airline when your country is really just one little city. I suppose you could use some jets to fly the servants back and forth, but Qatar's dictators and the dictators of neighboring Dubai and Abu Dhabi have a weird plan. They're all these rich, lazy princes with tiny populations, but as a hobby, they have decided to build massive airlines. Seriously, between those three little cities, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and the United Arab Emirates, which is just down the desert, and the Qatar city of Doha, there are three international airlines called Etihad, Emirates, and Qatar Airways, serving just about a million or so people, a few million people including servants. But between those three tiny places, those three little airlines have as many jets in service or on order as all the U.S. airlines combined. Seriously, three little medieval city-states in the Persian Gulf have as many passenger jets and pilots and stewardesses as the entire United States of America combined. Huh? How? Well, they're political playthings. You see, they have massive subsidies, from free airports built for them by the dictators to free or cheap fuel, of course, to, of course, no labor unions, to borrowing money cheaply on the sovereign credit of the dictatorships. So the plan of these princes is for these three state-owned or controlled airlines to get routes around the world that really have nothing to do with their squalid little desert kingdoms. These three airlines want to put the world's other airlines out of business. Airlines like Lufthansa in Germany or Qantas in Australia, or of course Air Canada. Here's what I mean. There are only a few thousand Canadians who live in Qatar or work there. You couldn't even keep one plane busy flying back and forth for them. But what Qatar wants to do, the same as Emirates Airlines and Etihad, is to fly people between, say, Toronto and India. Nothing to do with Qatar. Maybe they'd have a layover at the airport there. The whole point is to use a state-subsidized, state-owned Arab airline to drive other countries' private sector airlines out of business. Now, I'm pro-customer and pro-free market, but when an airline is owned by a dictatorship, it's more like an air force than an airline, and their purpose is to destroy Air Canada, and if WestJet ever went overseas, they'd try and destroy them too. They don't believe in free markets or competition in Qatar or the Emirates. They're crony capitalists and dictators, all run by lazy princes with abused servants who have few rights. Qatar Airways wants to kill Air Canada. Of course they do. But now they want to attack Canada in another way. Qatar wants the United Nations to locate the International Civil Aviation Organization, to move it from Montreal to that sweaty little sand trap of Qatar. The Civil Aviation Office has been in Montreal since the end of the Second World War. It's a recognition of Canada's expertise and good governance, frankly, a role in the war too. As in, we're transparent here. We value integrity. We're not censorious, bullying dictatorships where the government owns the airline. We're not about cozy little deals like that. This is the one UN agency headquartered in Canada. It's basically where civil aviation standards are hammered out. It's not political, it's administrative. You've probably never even heard of it. No reason to. But Qatar has. They want it. They want to add it to their collection of things, like it's some young blonde prostitute that some spoiled Qatari prince sees on his trip to Switzerland and simply must have her. They're used to buying up whatever they like over there in Qatar, and they think the UN agency is for sale. I mean, wouldn't that be dandy? The little petro-dictatorships of the Persian Gulf with their three state-owned, state-controlled airlines, massively subsidized, desperate for more landing slots around the world with which to undermine competitors. Wouldn't it be great if they could simply buy and put the world's aviation regulator in their back pocket? No more rule of law. No more independent courts. No more free press. Oh, and no more women being treated equal to men. No more labor unions, that's for sure. And no more religious groups like Christians or Hindus or yuck, those Jews. Yeah, of course Qatar would like to buy the UN's aviation office and move it to their sand trap. Just like Iran probably wants to move the UN's weapons inspection office to Tehran too. Syria probably wants to move the Human Rights Council to Damascus. Now, this move of our aviation council cannot happen without the vote of 60% of the countries at the UN. which sounds unlikely to happen, but news reports say Qatar is playing the race card and lobbying hard. They're calling on their fellow Sharia countries to vote against Canada because we're too chummy with the Jews, we're too friendly with democracies like Israel. So move the Civil Aviation Office to Qatar, the pitch goes. They know how to treat minorities and women and Jews there, not like those Canadian liberals do. This is the real risk of dealing with immature, spoiled brats who inherit entire countries from their dads, or in the case of Qatar, actually depose their own fathers to steal the keys to the kingdom. They buy skyscrapers, they buy soccer teams, they buy their own airlines, but they never quite grow up. They never have to, because hell, they're dictators and billionaires. But the world treats them with respect because they're so rich. So we put up with their bigotry and their juvenile schemes, and we pretend that Qatar is a real country instead of just a 19th century style slave-owning cotton plantation just built on oil instead of cotton. Canada didn't give Emirates Airlines more landing slots, so that dictatorship kicked out our military base there, putting our Canadian soldiers in jeopardy. Qatar didn't get its landing slots, so now they're playing the anti-Semitic race card against us, trying to move the UN agency. I think it's time the Canadian government started treating these jumped-up little sheiks and emirs and playboy princes, well, to start treating them just the same way they treat their little servant boys. Yeah, that's a polite way of putting it.